My question is, what can the US learn from how other countries have handled the pandemic? So last month, I was having an email conversation with my cousins and uncles in Taiwan. We talked about a great many things, and then we got to the topic of vacationing, during which they sent me a couple of pictures of their family staying in a hotel in the mountains and hiking through the forest. But the first thing I noticed was not their smiles or the beautiful landscape. It was their lack of face mask, even in crowded areas. I know COVID has really gotten to me, right? But the funny thing is, there hasn't been more than 100 cases of COVID in Taiwan since September, even though at one time they had more cases than the US did. This truly attests to, as Time magazine called it, a great American failure when it comes to handling the pandemic. So the question brought before us today is, what can the US learn from how other countries have handled the pandemic? And I believe there are three clear things we should learn. First, we should instate a national mask mandate with actual legal enforcement. Second, we should provide standardized regulations on when schools, restaurants, and other organizations are required to close. And third, we should require social and news media to check the scientific validity of content before it is posted to prevent misinformation. Now, why do you think my Taiwanese relatives are free to live life now? Well, it's because the government required 100% of the citizens to wear masks throughout the initial months of the pandemic. The first thing the US can learn from how other countries have handled the pandemic is that we should instate a national mask mandate with actual legal enforcement. According to the CDC on November 20th, an early study done tells us that cloth masks, not even surgical ones, have recently been shown to block up to 80% of respiratory particles containing COVID-19. But I know you've heard this statistic one too many times. Why then are we not listening? Brookings Institute on August the 31st tells us that most Americans know that masks are for public benefit, but the reason they still do not wear them is because they believe they are exercising their right and freedom not to. MIT on October the 8th tells us that if masks were mandated in April, tens of thousands of lives and dollars of economic flow would have been saved. Contrary to popular belief, there would not have been widespread protest if information was spread correctly last year. And going back to why my relatives in Taiwan are having fun on vacation, all schools, restaurants, and bars across the nation shut down simultaneously at the government's unified policy back in February of 2020. The second thing the US can learn from how other countries have handled the pandemic is we should produce standardized regulations on when schools, restaurants, and other organizations are required to close. Alabama Political Reporter on November the 30th tells us that in what seemed like a victory for churchgoers, the Supreme Court ruled that governors could not prevent churches from gathering, no matter how bad COVID got. I'm a Christian too, and I haven't been to church since February, but I still attend both Sunday school and service online every single week. There's no reason that the government should step in and not encourage, but in fact illegalize the necessary restrictions to prevent COVID spread. The Atlantic on March the 31st tells us that back in March, the government did not impose national guidelines and restrictions, so each state had differing approaches. What happened was that each state's government could not control entrances and exits from other states. So oftentimes their work to protect their own citizens became futile. NPR on March the 27th tells us that even experts like Anthony Fauci, who maintain that national shutdowns are unwarranted, support the closing of state borders or other unified policies to contain hotspots and reduce contact, with no recommendations on school openings or limits on positivity rates with closings. Many schools around the nation are scrambling to make unscientific, uneducated, and even unsafe decisions. And finally, what I believe is the most important reason that the virus didn't become widespread in Taiwan is the news media. The media always reported scientific facts with bias towards a collective safety, not towards an individualistic selfishness. The third things the US can learn from how other countries have handled the pandemic is they should require social and news media to check the scientific validity of content before it is posted to prevent misinformation. Scientific American on October the 11th tells us that a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research suggests that there is a significant correlation between areas of the country that received TV programming that downplayed the severity of the pandemic and areas that had greater numbers of cases and deaths. NBC on November the 30th tells us that even after Facebook discontinued several huge anti-vax pages, The movement still continued through smaller but more far-reaching follower groups. In fact, there are more and more anti-vaxxers in a period when vaccination should be the most welcomed and is readily available for citizens. Royal Society on October the 14th tells us that a study showed that being exposed to misinformation has a significantly negative correlation with willingness for one and one's loved ones to get vaccinated and the willingness to trust and obey public health protocol in a time when it is the most important. So this brings us back to our question, what can the US learn from how other countries have handled the pandemic? And there are three things that we should clearly learn. First, we should instate a national mask mandate with actual legal enforcement. Second, we should produce standardized regulations on when schools, restaurants, and other organizations are required to close. And third, we should require social and news media to check the scientific validity of content before it is posted to prevent misinformation. Now, I have to admit, I was very jealous when I saw my Taiwanese relatives vacationing together and living life as before. They sent those pictures to me like they did any other year without thinking that COVID might make me jealous of them. In fact, they probably even forgot about it. But I have hope that with a vaccine and a new administration to take the reins, maybe we'll become more compliant and less resistant to governmental restrictions and recommendations. I have hope that next summer, I'll get revenge by sending my relatives vacation pictures that will make them jealous. But most of all, I have hope that Americans can rise up to our challenge and work with a new government to reinstate our ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.